Everyone, my name is Cheryl Clark, and welcome to our session. We are hoping, as Brittany stated, to have a very lively discussion about building equity-centered evaluations. I want to introduce our small but mighty team, officially called the AmChip Equity Epidemiology and Evaluation Team. My name is Cheryl Clark. I'm Associate Director. Michaela Fry will be presenting in the future. And she's our program analyst, and Courtney Sally will be in the group as well. She serves as our program manager. This is the agenda that will guide our discussion today. Like Brittany says, we wanted to be very interactive, but we will have some guidance just to make sure we stay on the right train track. First, we'll start off with the equitable evaluation framework overview, and then we'll go through some telehealth examples using that framework as a guidance, and then we'll end with some questions and discussions, but there can be questions and discussions throughout our talk today. We have 3 objectives that we want to make sure that we cover. The first objective is to develop an awareness of equitable evaluation framework. And the second objective is to build knowledge around incorporating these equitable practices into your evaluation activities or activities that you oversee. And the third and actually, important objective is gain understanding how to apply these activities to telehealth work directly. But we hope that you can, feel free to try to plug and play with all the evaluation activities that you come into contact with. I want to introduce Courtney Sally, who's going to go over our first section of our discussion. Courtney.
Great, thank you, Cheryl. Next slide, please. So I'm going to get us started today by providing a high-level overview of the Equitable Evaluation Framework. This framework, created by the Equitable Evaluation Institute, is guided by 3 principles that provide a foundation for shifting the evaluation process from one that is defined by and perpetuates white supremacy to one that is based in participant ownership and incorporates and advances equity. So the 3 guiding principles are evaluation and evaluative work should be in service of equity. We have a moral imperative to place equity at the core of every step of the evaluation process. Next, evaluative work should be designed and implemented commensurate with the values underlining equity work, meaning the approach should be multiculturally valid and oriented toward participant ownership. And then last but certainly not least, evaluative work can and should answer critical questions about the effect of a strategy on different populations and the underlying systemic drivers of inequity, the ways in which history and cultural context are tangled up in the structural conditions and the change initiative itself, and the ways in which historical and cultural decisions have contributed to the present conditions. So these 3 principles guide the equitable evaluation framework to dismantle and redefine what they refer to as the common orthodoxies of evaluation. Next slide, please. So as a note throughout this presentation, when we are discussing the orthodoxies, the term foundation means organization or agency conducting or requesting the evaluation. So keeping in mind our time, I'm not going to dive very deeply into the orthodoxies, but I will provide some background and context to them. So the Equitable Evaluation Institute defines orthodoxies as tightly held beliefs about evaluative practice. These are often invisible and they pass off as, common sense. They are believed to be fundamental and affect the undercurrents of organizational culture. Many of the current orthodoxies conflict with achieving equity and in many cases actually reinforce inequities. The orthodoxies provided here are all inconsistent with equity work. So centering foundations and evaluators as the experts, promoting traditional ideas of expertise, and discounting the richness of qualitative data are some common themes among these beliefs. So I'll give us a few seconds to kind of scan the slide and read about these orthodoxies here as well as on the next slide. So. And then Michaela, whenever you're ready, you can go off to the next one. And we'll also be sending these in a handout as well. So don't feel like you have to rush and read everything right now. Okay, so in thinking about how the principles and orthodoxies may interact, we've highlighted how each principle may seek to confront the orthodoxies. And this is not prescriptive, but simply how we conceptualize their interaction. So on this slide, we have the principle that evaluation work is in service of and contributes to equity. The orthodoxies listed on the right prioritize service to the foundation and are exclusive of diverse thought and collaboration. So these would act as barriers to achieving this principle, and so they should be addressed. Some examples of how we can kind of turn these orthodoxies on their head so that they are in service of equity will take place a little bit later on in our presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so to uphold the principle that evaluative work should be designed and implemented in a way that is commensurate with the values underlying equity work, you would want to push back on these orthodoxies listed here, as they're not in support of being multiculturally valid or encourage participant ownership. So these orthodoxies that we thought were kind of related to this principle were that the foundation defines what success looks like. Evaluation should provide generalizable lessons, and trust and relationships come from doing the work but are not the starting point. So those are all be things that we want to work against. Next slide, please. And lastly, for this final principle, it may be helpful to confront these orthodoxies here. So credible evidence comes from quantitative data and experimental research. Evaluation should provide generalizable lessons. And then again, trust and relationships come from doing the work, but are not the starting point. And so as you've probably noticed, there's a lot of overlap in the interactions between the principles and the orthodoxies. And I'm going to pass it off now to Michaela to discuss this further using some examples.
Thank you so much, Courtney. So we are now going to walk you all through some examples of how to incorporate these principles into evaluation and push back on some of the traditional evaluation orthodoxies. So the first orthodoxy that we will reframe and reimagine is that the foundation defines what success looks like. So typically in a foundation, the board or program staff define what constitutes success for strategies with little input from grantees or groups affected by inequities. In some cases, these definitions of success are based on organizational models and literature that have been informed by racial bias and that fail to account for patterns of historic and structural discrimination. Resources then flow to organizations whose priorities, performance, and capacity reflect these definitions. Additionally, attention to outcomes linked to these definitions of success without parallel attention to how those outcomes are achieved can misinform foundations to whether their approach helps to build power and agency or maintains current power arrangements. So how can we shift this orthodoxy to align with the values of multicultural validity and participant ownership that is central to the second principle of the equitable evaluation framework? We can start by sharing the privilege of defining what success looks like with participants and community representatives. By leaning on communities to define what success looks like in a program they are participating in, evaluators and program implementers can align efforts with community and participant needs and desires. This creates more equitable opportunities for evaluation by illuminating to evaluators some conditions and metrics that are important for participants that the evaluators may have not chosen to measure if the participants did not inform the parameters of success. This can then lead to an increasing amount of evidence that is community informed and aligned with participant definitions of success, which can prompt the creation of more programs and evaluation plans that are participant and community guided. The long-term goal is to create an environment where community partnership and participant ownership is standard, and metrics that come from this leadership are widely accepted and respected, leading to resource flows to communities and community service institutions. So now let's walk through an example of what putting this into practice might look like. So this example is entirely fictional and was created only for illustrative purposes. This is also not a comprehensive example. There are many other equity considerations here that we will not be talking about. But for our purposes and in the interest of time, we will focus on just one aspect of the evaluation that could be made more equitable. So imagine that you are an evaluator at an organization that is putting on a telehealth program for children and youth with special healthcare needs. These children and youth are in an urban area, and for our purposes today, we will assume that everyone has a strong connection to broadband internet. One outcome in your evaluation plan is that participants have access to the hardware and software needed for telehealth services. One performance measure for this outcome is percentage of participants who received a laptop from your organization. You assume that everyone will get one because you are covering the costs. And this performance measure is a part of your process evaluation, or measuring if the program was implemented in the way you planned. To get a better sense of who would be eligible to participate in the program, you host a town hall. After hosting a town hall, you realize that parents and older youth with special healthcare needs have valuable perspectives on the program. You decide to create a steering committee, including parents and older youth representatives. After hosting the town hall, you realize that parents and older youth with with their guidance and insight into some of the needs of children and youth with special healthcare needs, you decide to add in a performance measure to this outcome. The additional performance measure is the percentage of participants that need accessibility tools who received the tools. This addition onto the evaluation plan on account of the guidance of the steering committee reflects a step in incorporating disability equity. Once again, you think 100% of the participants who need tools will get them because your organization is covering the costs. So that was first example of how to incorporate a little bit of equity into an evaluation plan. So this next orthodoxy that we will address is evaluations should provide generalizable lessons. So evaluations are often designed to provide synthesized, generalized findings that hide unique context, differential outcomes, and historical and structural drivers. This can lead to foundations toward the illusion that generalized approaches work similarly in any community or for any group. Some ways to shift this orthodoxy to be more aligned, multicultural validity and participant ownership include designing evaluations to reflect community and participant input and guidance, provide population and context-specific findings, illuminate differential outcomes, and demonstrate the impacts of historical and structural drivers. So building off of our previous example, midway through the telehealth program, you find that some of your process measures are not meeting their targets. While you thought 100% participants would receive laptops, 100% of participants who need accessibility tools would receive them, you see that only 80% of each group received the materials. You decided to disaggregate measures by race to get a better picture of the results. So the racial and ethnic breakdown ends up looking like this. That 67% of Black participants received their tools, 60% of Asian and Pacific Islander participants received tools. Of those who needed accessibility tools, only 40% of American Indian or Alaska Native participants ended up receiving the tools that they need. 100% of white participants received the tools that they need, and 75% of Hispanic or Latina participants received the tools that they need. So you decide to dig deeper into the root causes of these disparities that we see here and find out the following information. That home ownership is a factor here. So you find that the majority of the parents or guardians of the white participants in your program own their homes or have more stable housing. Due to a history of racism and mortgage lending, education access, and redlining, Black, AAPI, AIAN, and Hispanic and Latina populations have less generational wealth than their white counterparts and face extreme barriers in home ownership. Because of this, you find that some of these participants are more transient and have less stable housing. Sometimes their parents did not register change of address with the program and the tools were shipped to a previous address. You also find that a difference in work schedule is at play here. Find that your Black, AAPI, AIAN, and Hispanic and Latina participants have parents that work jobs that are not remote and cannot afford to stay home from work and sign for the tools when they are delivered. Because a signature is needed from an adult, the packages were sent to the central UPS office for participants to pick up. But because these same participants' parents and families rely more heavily on public transportation and cannot take time off work during the central station's business hours, some of the participants were not able to pick up their packages at the station. So you report these findings in the mid-year report to your funder and include performance measures disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and the evaluation plan moving forward. You think of ways these insights can improve the program to be more equitable for all participants. The next orthodoxy we have here is that trusts and relationships come from doing the work, but are not the starting point. So typically in evaluations and program implementation, there's a belief that building trust and relationships with participants and or affected groups comes from doing the work throughout the program. However, a lack of prior trust and relationship building leads to miscommunication, strained relationships, and misalignment of values between participants in the foundation. Shifting to a process that emphasizes long-term relationship building before a program starts will generate a solid base of trust, mutual respect, and participant guidance throughout the evaluation process. So what might that look like in practice? So say you're interested in applying for another grant to conduct a 3-year telehealth program for pregnant people with gestational diabetes in a primarily rural county. You realize that there needs to be some time spent building trust and relationships with the community. Time is taken to partner with a person who already has trust and rapport with the folks in this county. Time is also spent cultivating community buy-in, conducting needs assessments, and forming a community advisory board that will inform and guide the evaluation plan for this grant. And I think now I am passing this off to Cheryl.
I have to unmute myself, I'm sorry. Thank you, Michaela. And another orthodoxy is that when you select your evaluator, it should be based on credentials that are traditionally, implied to be notions of expertise. And so that tradition has been that there's definitely academic credentials, there's a noted subject matter expertise. Maybe they've done a million, types of evaluations before when you did an RFP or RFI, and then they also have like a certain skill or approach, methods to use to maybe analyze the evaluation results. And then they also have maybe some history of similar types of evaluation. Can you move the slide, Michaela? Okay, and I can't see anything, I'm sorry. And so what we should try to do is understand that the evaluation, it would be good for the evaluation to have, the evaluator, to have that lived experience. And as folks, my other two colleagues have said, have some kind of history of working with the diverse populations, and also demonstrate a cultural competence and humility, because as Michaela provided in her examples, it may be more nuanced ways to kind of figure out what's working and what's not. And then always, and they have to express a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because then they will be more apt to engage in those practices when they're evaluating your program's work. Next slide, please. So here's an example carrying forth with our illustration. When you think about choosing an evaluator, think about your population of interest. If we're talking about children with special healthcare needs in a well-connected urban area, and then the majority of these children will have a disability or differing abilities, you may not want to use your usual evaluator. You may want to contract with someone who's already working in the community, and particularly working among this very unique population. And also think about including community members and individuals who may have that lived experience, parents who are advocates for their children, et cetera, and use these culturally relevant evaluation practices, kind of what Michaela was describing. One of the things that I just want to ask, we're not at the discussion period, but and people are going to have to help me because I'm looking at my notes and can't see the folks in the audience. There's always this big kind of discussion whether you should get an internal or an external evaluator if you have the bandwidth to have internal evaluation. So I just want to get kind of a good 1 or 2 people you know, do you think using an internal evaluator is the best, or should you always go for an external? And if Michaela or Courtney can let me know, or field people if they want to raise their hands or put something in the chat, that would be very good. Do we have anyone that's volunteering up? What do they think, internal versus external?
We're a pretty small group, so feel free
No.
to just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Right, right. Feel free to just come off the, you know, come off mute and say something. What have you heard that, you know, always get an external one, or if you have the capacity, can you do things internally?
This is Eric from Utah. I'm going to tell you a lot of times budget is going to dictate that. There can be a lot of cost to hire an external evaluator. And I hate to say it, but a lot of times we operate on the cheap. And so it's quite often other duties as assigned with existing program staff.
Eric, I think that you're absolutely right. And does anyone else want to add to that before I put my 2 cents in? But that's a good point, Eric. Sometimes your finances and you dictate what you end up using. Anyone else? So say if you had all the money in the world and Eric in Utah gave you an extra budget to get an evaluator. You know, in my years of working, that sometimes the paid evaluators, they're considered, they may be more biased, because do they really want to tell you something's not working? You know, and I think it's going to be how you approach that evaluator. Like, I want to know what's not really hitting the mark. Because I've seen, and definitely has been written about, how sometimes the evaluators may be afraid to tell you things because you won't ask them back, because they don't really want to hear negative things about their program. But as always, and this is what happened in our previous presentation, we recommend that you keep an internal process going so there's no surprises. And then if you do have to monitor your own, then you can do so. But if you're contracting with an evaluator, you can also oversee that process and monitor and tweak along the way. You don't want to wait to the bitter end of your funding to realize that you missed some points that you could have caught earlier.
Am I able to pipe in here again too? I'm going to be really honest with you. I think a lot of times we already know how things are going. And do we really want someone to sugarcoat it, or do we want someone who's going to be truthful about it? I mean, if we want someone to sugarcoat it, then I think we need to question our own integrity on how we're running a program.
Eric, I can't see your face, but you're absolutely right. But I have worked in a place where people did not want folks to know because they were scared they're going to lose funding. And so, you know, you have that ethic of wanting to know straight shot, but some folks don't. But I think just to play in the middle, if you kind of are doing these evaluation checks along the way with your process with mid outcomes, then you're not surprised. And if there's something going off the rails, hopefully you can correct it before the end of your funding, you know, experience. But very good point in there. Next slide, please. Thank you, Eric. So I'm going to get into a little bit about rules of evidence, because this is something that you may have seen if you've done any kind of research, or you may have heard about different levels of evidence. And this is another thing that scares people off of evaluations a little bit, because traditionally we are taught, you know, that, you know, there's a hierarchy in the level of evidence, and starting with the lowest, which would be a literature review, maybe some QI, a program evaluation, kind of done at that ground level. But if you really want to make a dent into evidence, you're doing more experimental, you know, or review, a systemic review of experimental, like, you know, random controlled trials and things like that, meta-analysis. And in the middle, you may have these, because it's very unethical to do a lot of straight, you know, classic experiment randomization in public health or any kind of health setting. So you're really doing some kind of quasi-experimental where one group gets something and the other group doesn't, or they get it on a delay, and then you're seeing all of that. So do you think that has that intimidated anyone from wanting to do an evaluation to prove that their program works because they feel like they can't do level 1? Does anyone have any thoughts about that? And once again, I can't see. So if you want to come off mute or raise your hand or put them in the chat, I would appreciate it.
This is Sabra, and I can just share that in my past experiences that there was this careful line of evaluation versus research, and that we did not want to inadvertently cross, and so we avoided things that were in like level 1 or 2 or 3 a lot of times, so I think that was our experience, was wanting to not end up in IRB land unintentionally and that kind of thing.
And Sabra, I'm so happy you brought that up, because that was a classic case that a lot of public health or governmental entities will say, we're not a research shop, and evaluation was considered to be research, and sometimes somebody will come and change that way of thinking if they're powerful enough. And that's what happened to me in Florida. But you should be trying to evaluate your work and develop evidence, but some people are just put off because they can't do, like you said, the level 1s and the level 2s, or maybe they can with data, but not with people, and that's understandable. But they're all frightened about that they won't be able to add to the evidence base, which your grant may be asking you to do, because a lot of these things are to generate, a knowledge base to inform the evidence. Next slide, please. So the orthodoxy is that, this has been mentioned before, that credible evidence comes from, like quantitative data and experimental research. And so, like I was describing, it's based on this experimental design concept, such as randomized clinical trials as the gold standard. And then also too, which probably is more relevant to public health, that there's a mix of going to the literature, what's published in journals as an evidence source. And then also there's a dependence on quantitative data and quantitative methods to assess this evidence. But what we know is that public health is a mix of science, practice, and also intuitive application. And then as my 2 colleagues said, it's greatly influenced by social and cultural context. So a lot of those things that we're trying to do to measure what's working in public health may not really be hitting as we want to, because it's not designed for that. So the credible evidence determination should incorporate context and have maybe less reliance on traditional evidence models. And then also too, we must speak of the bias in publications for always publishing kind of on more of a certain line of evidence that has to be created in order to even get published. And then maybe we can kind of, use more qualitative and smaller data and more applicable data methods to handle that kind of thing, rather than relying on the big study and big numbers. Next slide, please. And I realize my graphics are all off. So now we're on the slide. I hope we're saying what credible evidence misses. We love that, especially on the clinical trial when we're doing like pharmaceutical stuff. Yeah, please, let's try to be as accurate and have the numbers as possible. But we're mixing in kind of this contextual with communities, it's kind of different. One of the things that, I'm being geeky here for a second, please bear with me. But one of the things that a lot of quantitative methods do is kind of average things out. It's more like what the population is experienced in general. And we know that a lot of the communities that are impacted by a lot of our disparities or inequities are smaller. but they most likely carry the most excess of the burden of adverse outcomes. So those quantitative analysis of data may not adequately pick up all those factors that are not dispersed, through the majority of the majority population, excuse me. Then also too, we do know that there's a ton of inequities in data life cycles, from collection to analysis to reporting, that further, muddy up the waters, that you may not get a clear view, or it may be lost of what smaller groups are experiencing, even though they have probably, like I was saying, more of the adverse outcomes due to context and due to history and due to systemic factors. And so those issues and solutions are often very nuanced, and then they're washed in situation and community context. So the evaluation, may not be generalizable and plug and play for one community to the other. And so that's unfortunately what's missed sometimes by our funders when they want to develop these kind of practice models that, folks can use with a little bit of tooling, but it may be a lot of tooling depending on what the context of that community is. Unless we understand that, we will always miss credible evidence, we'll miss that. Next slide, please. So what do we know? We know that, hey, small area analysis can be good, small can be good. And it can better show the efforts that are effective in a particular place or with a particular population. It can also help identify, more accurately causes or contributing factors to a condition. And so a company that is using methods that, probably the best of both worlds, that combine the quantitative with the qualitative. And this is an example, it's not the only way to do it, but you can use the quantitative data to kind of map the disparities, because you can do the rate ratios and say, this group experiences something 2 times or 3 times higher than this other group. And then to dig down deep into what is really happening, you may want to do qualitative data to discover the nuances of those causal factors and assessment of your interventions. Does that make sense? I just want to pause there and see if anyone has questions. Okay, and let me know if people are looking puzzled. Okay. So next slide, please. So what we've done is kind of given you an overview of equitable practices and evaluation, gone through some examples, and then I have hopefully cemented that the whole thing about obtaining evidence may be something that we need to kind of look at, and then that you, in applying for your grants or funding, need to prove to funders that what you're doing, is something. But I do want to stress, you need to do something. You need to still record what your impact has been. You still need to try to find out. So evaluation has been historically an extractive practice. External expertise was valued, over community expertise. And then the orthodoxies that we have provided some kind of examples for are these tightly held beliefs about evaluation practices that we must push back on and critically consider. So effective communities need to be included in defining the focus. I live in the DMV area, and then there's even talking about how Metro, our subway system, is not working. And one person said they need to ask the workers how to do it. And see, even that, so this could be applied to any situation where you want to find out what's going on. You need to ask people who are living in it. And so to build these equity-centered evaluation, it's important that you try to develop diverse teams, use culturally relevant evaluation practices, evaluate those systemic drivers using systemic indicators, and then include the effective communities or populations in a development and making sense of things. And you just have to do that. So one of the things that there's this author that I finally found an article I've been looking for. The ultimate aim for your evaluation is that it can really contribute to, how you address inequities by you're making them evident by the evaluation, and you're questioning the interventions and initiatives from the perspective of, and this is an important question, who's benefiting and who does not benefit? Why does something happen for group A, but not group B or C? And in what context is this happening in? And then if you really, really want to evaluate for equity and you're just not doing it for show, and you want to understand how you can make your services more equitable, you need to be so concerned about those fine-grained differences, and I'm quoting this author, that interventions have for different groups in society. And you need to have capacity to look at those interventions from the perspective of the systems in which they are acting. So you have to be aware. It doesn't mean you have to have a PhD in whatever land. No, but you need to be aware how you can collect that data that highlights those equities or inequities, and then how you're going to fine tune to make sure that you are being, as equitable in your services as possible.